In this video, we will look at all the CGI Christopher Nolan has used in his movies.
Did you know that Christopher Nolan absolutely hates CGI and green screens?
Christopher Nolan hates CGI so much.
Christopher Nolan hates CGI.
Looks like this is going to be a short one then. It turns out Christopher Nolan is as dependent on visual effects, probably more so than any other filmmaker out there. No, really.
I'm as dependent on visual effects, probably more so than any other filmmaker out there.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Nolan special of No CGI is really just invisible CGI. If you're new to the channel, I'm Jonas. I've been making visual effects for 21 years, which is why I can tell you about all the CGI there is, where people think it is not. I am a huge fan of Christopher Nolan. He's easily in the ranks of Kubrick, Hitchcock, Cameron and Spielberg, making popcorn movies of the finest quality. Nolan's unique brand is taking films that are typically exaggerated like science fiction and comic book heroes and, like Bourne Identity, make it more impressive, not by making it bigger, but by making it more real.
Get those wonderful toys.
No, really. Where does Batman get those wonderful toys? Can we believe Bruce Wayne invented this car, built a Batplane, and became the world's best forensic scientist just because he's a rich kid with a butler?
The police have got it wrong.
And where did Alfred bury the bodies of the 300 engineers that spent 10 years building the Batcave?
Because it's Batman Begins, we wanted to explain who dug the Batcave, you know? How does that work, you know? How does he pour 500 million tons of concrete in in secret?
Previous Batman films were extravagant and unreal on purpose, but Nolan had a different plan.
From the beginning, my interest was in taking on a superhero story but treating it in a realistic fashion.
Nolan's Batcave is just wet rock and old tunnels.
Charming.
And it's only expanded in steps so small it's semi-plausible Alfred and Bruce could have done it between movies. And the addition of Lucius from Applied Sciences as a sort of cue for Batman explains where the gadgets come from.
Grow up, 007.
Nolan's goal is to tell stories that can happen in real life and can therefore be filmed in real life. So when the stories eventually do go larger than life, you invest in it more because it has been established that it's a story about real people in the real world. But to create a movie where the fantastic stuff exists in the same universe as the realistic stuff, you have to pretend the unfilmable parts were as filmable as the real parts. So let's check out how he does that. In the same year as Rush Hour, Armageddon and Roland Emmerich's Godzilla, Nolan started his filmography with the independent feature Following. The film was shot on location in London on 16mm film, and the only visual effects credit is Dan Winthrop on opticals. And I think it's safe to say, Following uses no CGI. Memento is Nolan's The Terminator, using brilliant creativity to film a super high concept idea on a super low budget. The film was a hit at the box office, and its backwards narrative introduced us to that Nolan timeline warping that would characterize many of his films. The film has one digital imaging technician and one optical compositor, and I'm also gonna call no CGI on Memento. The only Christopher Nolan movie to not feature a Nolan brother in the writing credits, while a brilliant film, Insomnia feels like a gun-for-hire work. Warner Brothers were impressed with Memento and tossed Nolan someone else's screenplay for a low-risk remake of a Norwegian film to see if he could play the studio game and give them a decent, completely mainstream murder thriller.
They brought him in to solve an unspeakable crime.
Nolan would later reveal to Cinefix that they used Vaseline on an optical printer to obscure a soundman in the background, and that's the only visual effects in this film, so I'm also gonna say no CGI about Insomnia. But it made back more than twice its budget, and Nolan had passed his studio test. Dead set on giving us the first plausible Batman ever, Nolan had to figure out how to take something inherently unreal and make it seem real.
It's not necessarily about a direct reality, but it's about what I suppose you might term a cinematic reality. It's not about a literal reality.
While using a lot of special effects and miniatures, visual effects and CGI was in the plan from the beginning.
The decision was made early on to do outside the windows 100% CGI. So we made the decision to build the train on stage and surround it with a green screen.
The production built their own practical sets and used location photography in Chicago, but to avoid Gotham looking too much like any specific city, Double Negative, now known as DNEG, built a library of over 1 million HDR photos from Chicago, which they used to create a completely digital Gotham, as a combination of CGI and 3D matte paintings.
And all of this was actually sourced from reality. We shot something maybe like there's close to 1 million photographs of this.
Everything outside the windows is the CGI Gotham, as is Wayne Tower. The Narrows is an elaborate picture filmed with a motion control camera, sometimes matched precisely to a helicopter plate, to combine the real city with a model, and sometimes combined with a CGI background and CGI foreground elements. The monorail is CGI, sometimes tracked into helicopter plates from Chicago, and sometimes in shots that are fully CGI. CG Gotham was also used as a backdrop for the miniatures in the rooftop chase. In shots like these, the bottom is real and then we tilt up into a fully CG Gotham. The street and the tunnel here is real, and the background city is CGI. As real bats prove difficult to work with, all bat flocks in the film are created by MPC, using their proprietary crowd system.
We knew we were going to have to do digital bat shots.
And then seeing bats swarming all over you. Swarming all around.
What we actually did, we used a thing called a LiDAR scanner, and it records the three-dimensional shape of the environment. So by doing this, we can basically build a 3D version of the set, and then we can use that to sort of have the bats avoid objects and have them correspond to real objects as you photograph the plate as well.
As the actors were not really allowed to drive the tumbler down the streets, all views from inside the tumbler are filmed in a studio with green screen or blue screen for the windows, and the visual effects here are done by Rising Sun Pictures. Despite using more CGI than Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds, released the same year, the notion that Nolan gets everything in camera persists, with movie chatter accounts regularly posting things like the demon Batman mask was a practical effect achieved entirely in camera. These posts are debunked by a guy called Stefan Soretti. He's the Oscar-nominated VFX supervisor from films like Guardians of the Galaxy 3, and he was the visual effects supervisor for French Biff VFX, who handled the hallucination scenes, which includes 3D tracking of Batman and Scarecrow so they could add this goo and the worms, and they also did the jittering effect on the background. The white in Christian Bale's eyes here doesn't look so scary, so they CGI'd those too. Besides the bat coming out of Scarecrow's mouth, Biff also handled the CGI treatment of the fire-breathing demon horse. Yes, there was a practical Batman demon mask, and that was great. But no, this scene was not achieved all in camera, because it also used CGI. For the third act battle, Nolan knew he had to turn it up a notch.
Whilst I wanted the terms of the storytelling to be as realistic as possible, the expectation of this kind of epic film is that the action go as big as possible at the end.
But notice, the train Batman is swinging from is not on the set. So in shots like these, it's entirely CGI, including CGI Batman. Production VFX supervisor Dan Glass says to Cinefex, "Chris knew early on that there would be instances where we had no choice but to use digital animation. So we set about creating a proof of concept, developing a digital Batman that was very real." The CG Batman is also used in shots like these.
Well, you took my advice about theatricality a bit literally.
When I interviewed Paul Franklin in part 2 of the No CGI series, he said something interesting.
Chris is not afraid to use CG, but what he always does is he always starts and finishes any of these set piece sequences with reality. It's always a real shot at the beginning and a real shot at the end.
Notice as the CGI Batman comes flying in, on his movement down, we cut in action to the real Bale in costume, which helps sell the illusion. When you see it in action, you'll never know there was CGI. There's also something called a handover to a digidouble. That's when you start out with a live action actor and in the shot make a fluid transition to a fully CG character. Nolan uses this frequently in shots like these, when we start out on the real thing and end on something more extreme. And the following shot is full CGI.
This shot was challenging for a number of reasons. First off was that the Batman animation had to dovetail with a practical stunt. in the preceding shot where we actually see Batman exiting the train from inside the train. I constantly keep showing Chris where we're going with the shot, keeps looking at stuff, getting his feedback, getting his interaction there. And slowly the shot progresses and builds to the level where, like, oh, we're reaching critical mass, it's looking like it might be done. And then of course it's not, and we go and do it many more times until Chris is happy.
With the CGI Gotham, Batman, Batmobile and train, Nolan was free to come up with complete CGI shots in post-production. Alex Rüdke created an entirely digital shot seen from the monorail looking down into the street, including a CGI Batmobile turning a corner. The CGI Batmobile was also used in the scene where Batman jumps across the bridge. Production VFX supervisor Yannick Sers recalls: all views of the train racing down the street were 100% synthetic. Until things start breaking and miniatures come in handy again.
At the end of the movie, it's a combination of digital train, digital city, and then as soon as things start to blow up, when you really need all that kind of interaction and crashing, there's a switch over there gradually to using a miniature train. It still seems more feasible these days to actually do things with real things blowing up.
My sort of rule of thumb was we could do a fanciful visual effects sequence if the last shot was real. If those things can be clearly real and clearly have a sort of grittiness to them, it buys you a lot before that's more fanciful.
Batman Begins was Nolan's first big CGI production with over 600 visual effects shots created by over 300 artists. And this movie absolutely uses CGI. A story about people whose profession it is to come up with technical solutions to making the impossible seem possible to such a degree that they can claim it's all real. The irony of Christopher Nolan telling such a story is not lost on the film's real magicians, the visual effects artists at French Buff VFX, who handled the actual teleportation effects and doppelganger effects with clever split screens and traveling mats. They also added the more obvious CGI lightning effects, digital matte paintings, crowd duplications, and the most invisible CGI effects are the set extensions, such as this completely 3D CGI village. A dozen VFX artists created a little under 100 visual effects shots for The Prestige, and this film uses CGI.
I need to know how he does it. He has no trick.
It's real.
It's not. The key takeaway here is that visual effects, practical effects and production design work together, and visual effects is a part of the process from the beginning. In my 2 decades of working on Hollywood films, supervising Netflix shows and going on demanding shoots, the best collaboration tool I've come across is Milanote. Milanote is a great way of organizing a creative project. There's a whole selection of filmmaking templates to get you started. Production design can start a mood board and share it with all the other departments. We can drag in a location template and get an overview of all locations. And everyone can upload their photos and videos from the tech recce's. And I can make my own checklist of what visual effects needs to do on that location on the day. Every effect has its own board with concept designs and discussions, and I drag in examples from other movies as suggestions on how to solve it. It's just like organizing post-its and photos on a giant pegboard, except all teams can access it from anywhere. Because Milanote is kind enough to sponsor this video, you can get it for free with no time limit. Just use my link in the description. The first major difference in the visual effects for Nolan's second Batman film was that he was now hooked on IMAX with a much larger negative.
Working in IMAX this time, for the visual effects department especially, what that meant was obviously working at much larger resolutions and much more detail.
We were going in an extraordinarily high resolution, which also made all our visual effects companies very agitated.
The second challenge was that the almost steampunk feeling of Batman Begins was replaced with much more location photography in Chicago, requiring a much more open and natural looking city. Paul Franklin explains that DNEG had to completely remodel and retexture all the CGI Gotham assets. Not just because of the IMAX render resolution, but because of the complete change in production design. The CGI Wayne Tower from the previous film was replaced with this real building, which just had the Wayne logo added in CGI, plus a CGI Gotham background. Notice how the monorail has been added in the background here as a reminder that we're still sort of in the same universe. Besides hundreds of background buildings, Franklin says DNEG made 40 hero buildings that were used in the background in scenes like the armed car chase. Wayne's penthouse was supposed to be an addition to the rooftop of this Chicago hotel, but they found the floor plan was simply too small for what they had in mind. so they had to extend it over these two buildings with a completely CGI hotel. The entire fundraiser scene in Bruce's penthouse is filmed on a green screen, and the background in all these shots is the CGI Gotham. But wait, that's just VFX and compositing. Green screen is not CGI, right? Well, when the CGI Gotham you insert is made out of 3D models, then yep, that's CGI. Including the balcony and the helicopter landing pad and the scene where Batman dives off to save Rachel. And as they fall over the edge, there's a handover to the digidoubles. And everything in the fall is CGI, except in the shaky close-ups where we're back to the green screen. For the Hong Kong scene, that's really Christian Bale standing there, with the removal of the safety harness as the only visual effect. The jump itself was rehearsed and intended to be practical, with a stuntman diving off a building while bungee tethered to a helicopter, but the logistics and permissions proved too difficult to actually do it.
So we wound up adopting a visual effects approach instead.
Framestore handled the sequence with a green screen jump and a CGI Hong Kong, and a handover to the digital Batman flying around the skyscrapers. IMAX plates of the two skyscrapers were made, but they were also made as digital assets that could withstand being rendered in IMAX resolution. The 3D model and textures of the digital Batman had a complete rework since the last film, because the suit design had a complete makeover. All Hong Kong interiors were filmed on a green screen, and as Batman blows his way out, that's a miniature explosion by New Deal in an otherwise fully CG shot. As Batman extracts Lau via skyhook, some of the Hercules footage is real, but the skyhook gag itself is CGI, with the CGI Hercules and digidoubles of Batman and Lau. For those who think Nolan would never do the Marvel tracking marker and CGI face thing, remember, that's exactly what he did with Two-Face. Framestore and VFX supervisor Tim Weber handled the meticulous tracking, animating, interior gore, tracker cleanup and compositing for the Two-Face effect, which could only be made with CGI because it was the only way to get the negative space as opposed to makeup effect, which can only be additive.
We knew we were going to have to do the effect digitally.
The hospital explosion is a spectacular practical effect that deserves all the praise it gets, with the missing windows up here as just about the only CGI needed. Being allowed to use the real demolition of a building as a special effect in your movie is nothing new. They did it twice just in Lethal Weapon 3.
I'm too old for this.
The fascinating thing in Dark Knight is the collaboration between the demo team and the special effects team, because these two blow up buildings the exact opposite of one another. The demo team aimed to create as much critical damage to the structure as possible. The special effects team aimed to do as little damage as possible, because it's usually borrowed property. The demo team want as little debris as possible.
All of this material is to prevent any debris from flying out of the building.
And the special effects team create debris.
There's a debris strike, which is purely the glass going out, soft cork, which looks like the building's blowing up. The second time round, there's going to be flames going off. So
for demolition, you want people as far away as possible, but for special effects, you want your actors right in the middle. And Nolan wanted Heath to walk out the door in the same take as the building comes down. So what happens here is, these first charges are Chris Cobalt, lightweight cork and sparks, very harmless at this distance. Then they put in this pause for safety, and contrary to popular internet nonsense, this moment is carefully planned and rehearsed, and there is zero improvisation or happy accident going on here. I mean, they even animated it in the previs.
We rehearsed endlessly with Heath that morning. We got him to do exactly what he was going to do. We rehearsed it, I think, about 12 times.
And only now the building comes down. And the final effect is a wonderful combination of real demolition and Hollywood fireballs. Tumbler meets its demise after a close encounter with an RPG, and out comes Batman's new toy, the Batpod. While it was built as a real vehicle that could run upstairs and over cars, as you see in this murder of an IMAX camera from Dark Knight Rises, this heavy thing doesn't exactly stop on a dime. And every time you see it do anything remotely crazy, it's a completely CGI Batpod and a completely CGI Batman. This shot here is also fully CGI. The sequence where it is released from the tumbler was filmed and intended to be practical, but they realized in editing it wasn't working.
The problem was we quickly realised in post-production we were actually going to have to just completely replace it with our own CG tumbler, and then Batman and the Batpod was completely CG as it launched out in a very specific manner.
DNEG describes to Effects Guide the challenges of creating a CGI damaged tumbler, the wobbly panels, the new details, and not just a CGI Batman and Batpod, but the entire environment is CGI for the final shots.
He missed!
The famous truck flip is another great stunt, with CGI only needed for cleanup. In earlier days, when you covered your explosions with multiple cameras, you had to hide them in plain sight and just accept that the cameras could see one another. But now you can film with as many cameras as you want, put your lighting equipment and camera trucks right in the frame, and fix it in post. A helicopter crash is CGI, but as usual, Nolan likes to start and end with a real shot.
So we got real at the beginning and then visual effects come in.
We did LiDAR scans of all of the individual buildings so that we could rebuild them completely in CG. We're also then able to recreate a CG helicopter. And we matched all of that very carefully to a practical effect that we did on location.
So with the helicopter crash, if your brain has noticed that you've seen a couple of visual effects in the shots before, the punchline of it being real, I think really helps ground the film.
French Buff VFX joined the party once more, this time creating the effects for Wayne's ultimate privacy invasion, as well as the cell phone sonar visualizations.
Batman will stop you. He always stops you.
No, he doesn't.
What about that time with the two boats?
This is better than the two boats.
The two boats are not real. They are completely CGI boats in CGI water. Apart from the interior sets, only the sterns were built on these exterior green screen sets where the CGI boats were added. For the SWAT scene, all the interiors are filmed on a green screen stage with a CGI Gotham, but the final stunt is real.
I felt that it was very important with our final action set piece that we finish with something real, because we knew we were going to do most of it on the set.
With CGI only needed on the building to remove mattresses and add windows. Because the interior green screen sets are not filmed the same place as the exterior location, these two shots that reveal both are 100% CGI. The shot of Joker's Great Fall is a green screen stunt with a CGI Gotham, and the dangling Joker is Heath Ledger on a green screen. Half a dozen vendors contributed to The Dark Knight's Oscar-nominated 700 visual effects shots, which ultimately lost to the curious case of Benjamin Button's only 400 visual effects shots. And this film massively uses CGI. Inception came out the same year as Iron Man 2, only a few years into the MCU, and the notion that CGI is bad and that Nolan is great for not using it wasn't a thing yet. Movie critics like Ebert just praised the movie for its astonishing special effects. But the latest decade has seen some serious revisionism where people claim Nolan avoided CGI at all costs. For instance, by not using CGI for the rotating hallway and the zero-G hotel scenes. First of all, a shot like this is not possible without massive amounts of digital rig removal. But is that really CGI? You're just painting out the wires. Check out how much the background changes in the befores and afters, and how the door and the lamp and the carpet all seem to pop and change shape. That's because you can't just paint out the cables in a complicated shot like this. You have to recreate everything behind the cables, including the actors' faces. Simpler shots used to be solved with a motion control camera that could replicate the camera move so that you could create a clean plate, so you had a clean background to paste on top of the cables. But today it's easier to create your own clean plate in post, using a combination of 3D and camera projection. And the more complicated this gets, the more it's kinda CGI. And the scene still needs CGI for the floating pieces, as well as the floating droplets of blood. But of course the amaze factor here is that the rotating hallway itself is real, and not a green screen CGI solution. But as a VFX supervisor myself, I must say that as long as the corridor is just a corridor, a rotating set is historically the only way anyone would have ever solved a scene like this. Fred Astaire did it, Lionel Richie did it, Nightmare on Elm Street did it, Poltergeist did it, NSYNC did it, and of course, Nolan's biggest source of inspiration, Stanley Kubrick, did it for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Arguably the rotating corridor in Inception is bigger than these, so I'm not saying it was easy, just that this would always be the way to solve this. But Marvel would have done it entirely with CGI, right? Yes, they probably would, but they would also have had the corridor break down reality and fold in on itself, which would be a really good reason to use CGI. It's an essential theme in Inception that you can't tell the dream world from the real world, as opposed to other dream movies where the dream world is specifically designed to be out of this world. Inception doesn't need 2000 visual effects shots, simply because even in the dream world, it's mostly just people talking in natural locations. And when the dream world finally does go full Marvel and break down reality and fold in on itself, Nolan also turns to CGI.
When Paris folds over, that shot was designed by one of the CG supervisors at DNEG, Alison Wortman. Ali created this test animation showing how the folding mechanism might work. We showed it to Chris and he said, that's the shot.
But now we also have this AI-generated garbage trying to tell you that Nolan avoided CGI at all costs and did this in camera. Several shots have some funky CGI going on in the background that you may or may not have noticed. No CGI was used in the Paris cafe scene in Inception, which was all solved in camera, says hundreds of posts. Well, we already talked to Paul Franklin about this scene, and while the basis for the scene is a series of practical explosions with air cannons and lightweight foam props, CGI was used for glass and porcelain. CG assets of fruits, cobbles and books went through a destruction simulation in 1000 frames per second timeline to match with the super slow motion footage. The secondary explosions are CGI, the cobblestone explosions. That shot is fully CGI, and so is this one. The mirror scene was practical with subtle visual effects only needed to remove the camera crew, says social media. Corridor crew already looked at this scene, but I'll give you a quick recap. Yes, they erased the camera crew and the frame around the mirror. But most notably, the practical mirrors are not tall enough to reach the top of the frame, so they're extended here and here. And since everything beyond the second mirror is a distorted mess, it's entirely recreated digitally. But they also changed the environment outside the mirror, leaving very little of the original shot intact. Ariadne breaks the mirror and reveals this long path, which in reality has been there all along. But see these graffiti things on the ground? These shots were filmed in the same place. And this long path has been in this shot all along, so the entire background in this shot is digitally replaced. When Ariadne folds up this bridge and walks across it in the following shot, both shots are filmed on the same location. And to remove the bridge and animate it in place in this shot, the entire background in this shot is a digital recreation. This shot was filmed on location in Paris with a green screen here and a digital background, and this shot was filmed on a rotating green screen set. Now we gotta talk about no green screen. Using a blue or green screen is a great way to pull a black and white matte to replace the background of the shot. But besides creating a lot of bounce and spill that contaminates the set in false colors, the creative process of making the background now has to happen in post. This easily becomes the single most time-consuming part of visual effects, because no one really knows exactly what the shot should look like before it's done. Rotoscoping is when you replace the background without a green screen by painstakingly painting the black and white mask one frame at a time, 24 frames per second. It's much more time-consuming and it comes with a lot of edge problems that takes a lot of very talented digital compositing to fix, something that was impossible with optical compositing. But the benefit is that all the answers about framing, exposure, timing, the brightness of the sky, the color of the shadows is like a cheat sheet for the compositors, giving them a shortcut so they can get to the final version faster. So all these shots have a massive amount of digital background replacement, but it looks natural because it was filmed on location without green screen. When filmmakers proudly reject green screen, people always rave about how these bold filmmakers reject modern computer graphics in favor of old school film techniques.
We used no green screen on this show. This is a show that embraced practical effects.
But the reality is the exact opposite. They are rejecting the old, tired technique of chroma keying in favor of computer graphics, something they can only do because the visual effects supervisor told them, if you want the best results, this is how we should do it. For instance, in Inception, when Cobb and Ariadne arrive in Limbo City, this is what the location looked like, and this is what the final shot looked like. The entire city is 100% CGI. But there are no green screens. So Nolan could basically tell DNEG, This is the shot. Sure, I want you to replace everything with CGI, but apart from that, this is the shot. As they walk around Cobb and Maul's abandoned city, the scene was filmed at Los Angeles Power and Water, which provided the foreground and a great reference for the completely CGI city and water in the background. The biggest enemy of rotoscoping is long hair flapping in the wind, so for scenes like these, they would still pop in a green screen. Whole green screen sets still have their place, but mostly for interior sets that are artificially lit anyway and don't need natural lighting. The beach of Limbo was filmed on an empty beach with CGI buildings and destruction simulations of the decaying buildings. Notice how the CGI backgrounds are perfectly tracked and integrated into the entire handheld scene. The answer to how do you make a train run down a street is, you can't, but you can make a truck cosplay as a train. And then run the truck down the street. DNEG was tasked with adding the CGI debris and destruction from the wheels. The Sterigag was built practically, and VFX was tasked with removing the scaffolding. This is another great example of a camera move being too complicated to paint out a rig frame by frame, so instead, DNEG replaced the environment below the stairs with CGI. The fortress in the snow was a practical build by Chris Cobalt. The wide shot is a completely CGI fortress in a CGI landscape. For the explosion, they tried to blow up the real set, but the tower fell the wrong way. So New Deal had to do a large-scale model demolition. DNEG ended up replacing the tower with CGI in this shot and in this shot. And for the avalanches, they just created actual avalanches. The final destruction of Limbo is, of course, entirely CGI, with a green screen shot for Ariadne's fall.
And the Oscar goes to Inception.
Inception had around 500 visual effects shots, and DNEG's VFX supervisors Paul Franklin, Andrew Lockley and Peter Bebb, along with special effects supervisor Chris Cobalt, won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects. And Inception absolutely uses CGI. After his 3 Batman films and Inception greatly relied on visual effects and CGI, the Visual Effects Society gave Christopher Nolan their first ever Visionary Award for uniquely and consistently employing the art and science of visual effects. And in his acceptance speech, he made it very clear how much he depends on visual effects and that he is aware of the misconception that he doesn't.
Christopher Nolan. It's a great honor to be getting an award from the VES Society. I feel a little guilty receiving it from you guys as somebody who often appears in the press talking about my use of CG, like an actress talking about her use of Botox. And I'm as dependent on visual effects, probably more so than any other filmmaker out there. And I'm very, very grateful to and appreciative of all of the people, many of whom I've worked with in this room, who've helped bring my visions to life.
From the almost steampunk of Batman Begins to the natural Chicago of The Dark Knight, The Dark Knight Rises expanded the scope once again, this time centering much of the action around Pittsburgh. As they created the CGI Gotham for the 3rd time now, Paul Franklin explains to Computer Graphics World, we digitized and modeled a whole 4-city block area of Pittsburgh. The scene where Bane hijacks a CIA turboprop starts with a practical stunt with real stuntmen lowered from a Hercules towards the smaller plane. Fun fact. See these wires? That's actually the opposite of wire removal. The cables are only in the final shots, not in the raw IMAX footage. So for these shots they would fly up with the turboprop and walk out the door and onto the wings. And the cables are CGI. All the plane interiors were filmed in a gimbal on the ground that would tilt and become a vertical set. But forget about miniatures and CGI for a moment. The greatest visual effect ever invented is simply just the cut, and how you can cut from one location to a completely different one, and the audience will be tricked and assume they're the same. Did you catch it? This is the gimbal on the ground, with background added by DNEG. These are stunt performers on the stunt plane. You can see from the sunlight hitting the floor that this plane is completely empty. It doesn't have the seats you see on the gimbal set. But now the audience is convinced these people are in the air. Because they were using wind machines, they couldn't put up green screens. And Paul Franklin said to Nolan, "Everything we did on Inception tells me that we don't need green screens. We can just commit to rotoscoping this." The breakaway of the plane was made with a miniature effect, as was the tail when it pops off. When Bane drops the wreckage at the end, they really lifted a fuselage into the air and dropped it around these two fellas here, which, if you stabilize the footage, are pretty obviously two dummies, just like in this test shot. And man, Powell's wig is really selling this shot. So this looks like practical miniature work. But Nolan says to Cinefix, DNEG had to enhance or completely replace some miniature elements with more flexible CG elements. So let's take a look at this digital glue. First, before the tail pops off, Franklin confirms that's a CGI tail. The miniature has a lot of miniature artifacts, like these flames and sparks, and the fire reflecting in the hull, and the flashes inside the windows. None of this is in the movie because it's all been replaced or painted out. Now look at these guys clinging to the outside of the plane. They're not in the miniature. And look at how the stabilizers and wings flap in the air resistance here, something the miniature also didn't do. Cinefix says, ultimately Double Negative replaced some of the miniature photography with CGI, the CG team copying frame for frame how the plane broke apart. Oh, and these two shots here are exactly the same shot, just with different visual effects added. The pit, the prison that Bane sends Bruce Wayne to, was a practical set. Except it wasn't a practical set, it was two practical sets. The prison was one set and the tunnel exit was another. And connecting them was a green screen at the bottom where DNEG inserted a 3D model of the prison set, complete with little CG animated people. Ironically, the rope that they used for safety in the movie would be really dangerous in reality, so a real safety harness was painted out and the rope is animated and rendered in CGI. As Bruce exits the pit, that's just a little wall on location in India, with a green screen in the middle for adding the CG pit, but it looks like they didn't even need that in the final cut. The Batpod returns, and as usual when it makes sharp turns, funky rolls or crazy jumps, it's all CGI, with a CGI Batman or Catwoman. The practical Batpod was too heavy to perform that ramp jump, so they did it with a normal motorbike, animated the CG Batpod on top, and replaced the motorbike with the CGI version. Batman has a new toy, the Bat, which is first and foremost a practical construction, with visual effects only needed for rig removal, plus CGI flaps and propellers. But look at this shot where it comes banking in like a real plane or helicopter. The real rig didn't have a lot of flexibility, so it doesn't quite nail the banking as it goes around the corner. A photoreal CGI version of the Bat was made and replaced the practical one in shots like these. Notice how the background in the street chase reveals we're in Pittsburgh, not the megacity of Gotham. This is one of the many cases the CGI Gotham assets were used. Something I wish he'd done for the hospital explosion in Dark Knight, because I don't know what that is, but it's not Gotham. Also notice how visual effects was used to remove cars and restore the buildings behind them, for continuity issues. Different rigs were made for different purposes, like this cable system, great for flyovers. But see how it stops here? So when it blasts off into the distance, that's the CGI Bat. They would also dangle it from a helicopter for shots like these. But Franklin says that while it looked fantastic, the downdraft from the helicopter kept pushing the Bat away, so they had to replace it entirely with the CGI Bat. Every shot of the Bat soaring away, flying over the rooftops, through the city, evading CGI missiles and CGI explosions, are of course the completely CGI Bat.
You could put our digital Bat alongside the original cinematography and you'd be hard pressed to tell which one was which.
They were able to really put an incredible amount of attention to detail in terms of the textures and the lighting and everything, and so the visual effects are truly seamless.
For entering the Batcave through the waterfall, a reference was filmed, but with all this splashing water you can't just paint out the rig, so they projected the footage onto the animated digital Bat, which would also be a little bit more smooth and not as clunky as the rig. As the bat maneuvers into the cave to land, the bat and the Batcave cubes are completely CGI, until there's a handover to the practical bat and set. The stadium scene used an impressive 10,000 extras, but with seats for 80,000, this still wasn't enough to fill the stadium. And DNEG expanded with a CG crowd simulation, as well as green screened extras. Just happy sports fans living in the moment. Paul Franklin explains how they filmed as much as possible practically, but the entire collapse is CGI.
Tom Struthers' magnificent stunt team were able to work out who was going to be real, who was going to be a digital double in the background, and our department built a raised section of the field with holes in it that the stuntmen could drop into. And then what we did digitally is replace the whole surface of the field. And then we took this all away and we spent months creating the effect of the collapsing field.
CGI was also used when the sewers explode across Gotham, various green screen sets. When Bane blows the bridges, DNEG used physics simulations on LiDAR scans of the bridges, as well as simulated explosion and water splash elements. And the ice under the bridges is a combination of LiDAR scans and digital matte paintings. Saving Gotham from the bomb, the CG bat has a near miss with a CG skyscraper, and DNEG added the CG explosion simulation. And this is when Nolan wasn't afraid to use CGI for nukes, so they would look like nukes. And, spoiler alert for Dark Knight Rises, most amusingly, to not spoil the ending to any paparazzis, Nolan had production department put Miranda Tate's name on Wayne's gravestone and let visual effects change it in post. The Dark Knight Rises has around 500 visual effects shots, all handled by DNEG, and this movie uses CGI. If Nolan's filmography so far has been one long flirt with Stanley Kubrick, Interstellar is his love letter. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey, four-dimensional beings contact the Earthlings and give us a wormhole in space. We travel there in a spaceship with a centrifuge for artificial gravity. One person gets to go and visit the supreme beings, who have prepared a 5-dimensional artificial world for him of a deeply personal nature. Actually, this is also Contact. The first step in creating a futuristic space movie that's grounded in reality in that Nolan trademark way is to not make a futuristic space movie at all.
A huge amount of the creative energy goes into the parlor game of trying to figure out, what a pair of trousers is going to look like in the future, or what a pair of glasses is going to look like in the future. And you're never going to get it right. I wanted to eliminate that thinking entirely from the design process so that we could put our efforts elsewhere.
So no iRobot or Minority Report CGI skylines. Interstellar is just filmed in contemporary settings without wondering what a fancy future might look like. And the spaceships are heavily inspired by NASA surfaces, rather than typical science fiction panels and greebles. Famous for not using green screens, the space exteriors outside the spacecraft were front projected to be captured in camera, so the actors had the real sights to react to. Sometimes the footage was projected back at the actors for interactive lighting. It's used a little bit like the volume, but instead of LED panels, it's a projector like in your home cinema. The downside by not using green screen is that you have no control in post, and sometimes what they see out the windows doesn't match what's reflected in the helmets. And even though this is not green screen, it's still CGI. The CGI just has to be finished before filming so it can be projected on the day. And it's not a wholesale solution. You will still have to replace some of it in post. The zero-G scenes on the spaceship were made with wire setups that kept changing orientation between shots so that the audience would never be able to guess which way was up.
The idea is that if you dwell on one trick too long, the audience will catch it. And so we used a bunch of different techniques simulating zero gravity.
Very similar to 2001: A Space Odyssey. The launch, which inexplicably uses Apollo-H propulsion rockets when Star Trek hover technology exists, was made using a CGI rocket, and this shot is 100% CGI. But you can see how Nolan keeps the authentic feeling by restricting the camera to be attached to the spaceship, the same as NASA footage, as opposed to the more normal sci-fi movie space flyby. Which gets me talking about spaceships in movies. My favorite spaceships ever are everything in the original Star Wars trilogy, and something like the Discovery and the Space Station in 2001. The limited camera technology they had available for these miniature shoots forced them to carefully consider shot design, silhouette and movement, which automatically gives them a shared camera language with actual space photography, which is also restricted. Even when they did crazier space shots than anyone had done before, they were still restricted by motion control cameras. Now, as a CGI guy, you can never make me say CGI can't do that, because it totally can, and better. But it requires a director who is willing to limit themselves to these restrictions. Like for instance, Gareth Edwards in Rogue One, because these space shots look amazing. But because CGI can do anything, lots of directors don't practice the restraint needed to preserve an authentic feeling. And the result is so overwhelming, it ironically ends up as underwhelming, because we disconnect from it. So Nolan forced restrictions upon himself, for instance by mounting the full-size Ranger on a gimbal that he could control live on the set. All of the miniature composite shots were made with the same restrictive philosophy to closely mimic actual space images, again using a black background instead of green screen for accurate space lighting, and rotoscoping in a CGI background. Supervisor Paul Franklin says they still used CGI spaceships for atmospheric entries, when the transport is ejected into the black hole, and when the Ranger is swept up by the wave.
That ocean planet in Interstellar, the one with massive tidal waves, 0 CGI.
I don't know who makes these posts, but millions of people love to hear this stuff. Of course, the waves are 100% CGI, with DNEG working with a tricky combination of animation and water simulation to create waves with the right amount of details to look huge. And here you can see some limitations of rotoscoping. If this had been filmed on green or blue screen, they could have extracted the water splashes and used them in the shot. But because the ship is rotoscoped, the water splashes are only inside the roto shape, so they have to patch up with CGI water splashes. No green screen is just a trade-off where you get more natural lighting, but more visual effects work.
Did you know that, Cars? The AI machine from the movie Interstellar wasn't CGI. It was a puppet controlled by Bill Urich, who also voiced a character.
I think it's hilarious. These people want you to believe a puppeteer did this in water while wearing this. While Franklin confirms most of the shots are made with a practical puppet, all the crazy action is using 100% CGI robots in CGI water. This is also the CGI robot. As is this. This is just a dude picking her up and they replaced him with the CGI robot.
Using more elaborate visual effects, you have a CG version that you do for the things that couldn't be puppeteered.
This is the CGI robot. And floating in 0G is also the CGI version. This shot has a Texas switch. That's the CGI, and this is real. Also, when he's really far away, honestly, why even bother with a puppet? Fix it in post.
That blocky robot in Interstellar, it was 100% real. Most people assumed they were CGI, but they weren't. TARS was actually operated by a puppeteer.
Like Emma Thomas said, if you dwell on one trick too long, the audience will catch it. So while a puppet is cool, this is CGI. One of the biggest CGI components in this film is the Tesseract, also often described as a practical set which used 0 CGI. The only plausible explanation to these posts is that the people who write about how the movie Interstellar was made have never actually seen the movie Interstellar. Where Nolan's CGI usually has to dial in and match what was built and filmed, the Tesseract was conceptually designed entirely in CGI, and production design had to replicate that in real life. A set was built for Matthew McConaughey to interact with in close-ups, and as usual, this is great for the photoreal interaction in the foreground, but all the stuff up here in the background is CGI. Because this is what the set looks like, and this is what's in the film. Everything outside this X is CGI. In close-ups of Cooper falling through space-time, CG footage of the Tesseract was projected around him for lighting and reflections, but it was all replaced in post. So much nonsense has been written about how this practical set used 0 CGI, so please take some time to enjoy this montage of the beautiful, completely CGI Tesseract. For these 4-dimensional views, the closest room was filmed practically, it was recreated entirely with 3D animation, and this CGI copy was then offset in time and space in apparent infinity. And the scene ends with a beautiful collapse of the 100% CGI Tesseract. But the biggest CGI superstar of this show, probably of any Nolan film, is Gargantua. Visualized only as the glowing accretion disk around the black hole itself, the gravitational lensing will bend the light and make the disk appear to wrap around the top and bottom of the hole. This is not a new concept, as Jean-Pierre Luminet created this rendering in 1979, but it had never been done in feature film quality before. Gravitational lensing is not something any commercial 3D renderer can do out of the box, because it has zero appliance in daily computer graphics. So DNEG had to write their own renderer for the purpose. Notice that Luminet's illustration is brighter on one side than on the other. That's because of the Doppler effect of the light going around the center, a scientific accuracy they decided to ignore for Interstellar in the interest of just creating something that looked awesome. According to 1 Trillion Posts, Christopher Nolan hates CGI so much he planted the corn for real instead of using CGI.
Did you know that Christopher Nolan absolutely hates CGI and green screens? You remember those endless cornfield scenes in Interstellar, right? Most directors would just use computer effects. But Nolan, he literally made his crew plant a massive 500-acre real cornfield.
Even if we play the devil's advocate for a minute and forget that Nolan absolutely relied on CGI for every set piece in the film, and doesn't really appear to hate CGI at all, planting your own corn for your movie, either because you want to destroy it or because it's not there, is a thing. They did it on Man of Steel, they did it on Signs, they did it on Fearless, they did it on Field of Dreams. Like, this is a long established thing you can do for your movie. Like the rotating hallway in Inception, huge props to the practical departments for building this for real. It looks great, but this is just one of the things that have been done for movies for a long time. There was no bold choice to not use CGI for this. The sandstorm in the city was mostly practical, but in wide shots from afar, it's CGI. The Cooper station at the end of the movie, although not seen from the outside, is an O'Neill cylinder, an elongated centrifuge that rotates to create artificial gravity on the inside. This was filmed outside, and rotoscoping was used to insert the CGI background behind the corn.
William Goldman's legendary book, Adventures in the Screen Trade, warned writers never to write scripts with things so imaginative they could never be practically filmed.
Today's visual effects masters prove there is nothing that can't be brought to life.
With 700 VFX shots and several components that relied on CGI from before filming even began, Interstellar is arguably the most CGI-dependent film Nolan has ever made.
And the Oscar goes to Interstellar.
And production VFX supervisor Paul Franklin, DNEG VFX supervisor Andrew Lockley, New Deal VFX supervisor Ian Hunter, and special effects supervisor Scott Fisher won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects. And this film hugely uses CGI. Despite the long-running reputation for avoiding CGI, Dunkirk is the first of his big movies where Nolan really practiced that. He felt these impossible CGI shots stick out like a sore thumb when used in war movies. So he and production VFX supervisor Andrew Jackson avoided planning for any extensive visual effects use. Shot the film without a clear plan, figuring out later what to fix in post. The VFX crew had almost no footprint on the set, no tracking markers or green screens, no script down of which scenes would use visual effects, and the CG asset team spent their time on set taking survey photos to create photoreal CG models of every boat and plane in the film, not knowing where or if these assets would be used. The result is a film that has been praised for its raw, authentic feeling, but also heavily criticized by history buffs. Modern architecture, modern cranes, and on the English side, the Weymouth Sea Life Tower, built in 2012, has a cameo. And apparently the film vastly downplays the number of ships and planes used in the operation.
This misconception is reinforced when we see only 3 Spitfires in the movie. They didn't just send 3. In reality, 3,500 sorties were flown in to aid the evacuation.
Now, no surprise, I'm a movie nerd, not a history nerd. I don't notice or care about a few historical inaccuracies. I think it's fine they used kilts in Braveheart, even though that historically didn't happen until several hundred years later. It feels true in spirit, I guess, and it enhanced the story rather than diluting it. But Nolan chose to shoot his film on location in the actual city of Dunkirk, as it stood in 2016. Dunkirk was bombed to rubble at the time, and historians point to Saving Private Ryan as a much better depiction of wartime devastation. But by far the most aggravating critique of this film is that the 380,000 troops were filmed using fewer than 2,000 extras.
I mean, where is everyone? There should be 400,000 men on this beach, but there's hardly anyone. Dunkirk looked nothing like this.
And even with the cardboard cutouts, there's only a few thousand people here. Again, historians point at previous movies like Atonement for much better depictions of this. The online film buzz, which normally loves to say that CGI is bad and Nolan is great for not using it, find the imagery in Dunkirk so underwhelming that they all ask, why didn't Nolan use some CGI for the ships and the planes and the people and the cleanup of modern architecture? Because a little CGI would have made this movie better.
For the most part, I enjoyed Dunkirk and appreciated what it was trying to do. I didn't think there would ever be another big budget war movie with a heavy focus on practical effects, but I'm not too stubborn to admit that by refusing to use CGI altogether, it undermines the movie's credibility when you can't pull it off for real. Shooting on location doesn't mean shit when the set hasn't been dressed properly.
And the answer is, he did. He just made sure to use so little CGI that you wouldn't think he did. The dogfights were mostly practical, using real aircraft and remote-controlled scale models. Jackson explains the photoreal CGI planes were used in the background in a handful of shots, but they were mostly used for rendering out parts of the airplane to cover up camera rigs or change the markings on shots that had been flipped. For extended scenes of banking and acting inside the planes, the cockpit shots were filmed on a gimbal near the coast to get the sky and the ocean horizon as a natural background, as opposed to green screen. Besides cleanup of false reflections in the canopies, in shots where they tilted the gimbal so much they revealed the nearby coastline, Dyneck had to go in and restore the ocean, which was a ton of problems with dirt and refractions because they didn't use a green screen. And that's the acceptable trade-off for getting natural lighting and a mostly natural background. The gimbal didn't have a tail, so this is a CGI object added by Dyneck. Cockpit mirrors and gun sights are usually a composite of 2 or more aerial plates. This was filmed with the propeller running and the landing gear already lowered, so Dyneck replaced both of these with CGI. Tracer shots and bombs were CGI. Invisibly, CGI water patches were used in ocean shots to cover up the film cruise boats used to film other angles. Real ships were used, but not enough, so wide shots duplicated the filmed ships and applied several CGI ships. The sinking of the hospital ship was a forced perspective half-scale ship lowered by a crane, which was painted out by Dyneck. But the biggest CGI component in Dunkirk is the sinking minesweeper.
Even the ones we see sink in the water was all done in front of a camera.
Sorry, that's not accurate. Jackson explains the sinking minesweeper is a 100% CGI model, including a Titanic-style crowd simulation of the sailors on the deck. Look at them cling to the railing like little ants, and see how small they are compared to this massive cannon. That's supposed to be the same ship as this shot. But notice these giants here walking around on the deck and see how big they are compared to the cannon now? That's because this is the practical ship dressed up to look like the minesweeper, but it's not to scale. This ship is too small. Speaking of crowd simulations, guess where else they were used? That's right, the beaches. They duplicated some of the soldiers in post with 2D elements, but there are also CGI crowd simulations used to multiply the number of troops, particularly in the aerial flyovers. These shots were not filmed in the ocean, but in this water tank with a grey background, and an insane amount of roto and cleanup was needed to extract the water splashes and extend the CG ocean to the horizon. Dyneck also added the background smoke in shots like these, and, contrary to popular belief, removed modern architecture in the background for historical accuracy. But Nolan, proud to print as much as possible of the film as original negative, chose to forego a lot of these when he felt people wouldn't notice. In Cinefex, Dyneck thanks over 300 people for contributing to a little over 400 visual effects shots. Dunkirk won the Visual Effects Society's award for Outstanding Supporting Visual Effects in a photoreal feature. And although there's way less than Interstellar or Batman, Dunkirk uses CGI.
Shooting Dunkirk, we were right next to an offshore wind farm. And some of the only visual effects we really had to do in Dunkirk were erasing the windmills from the shots.
You don't get that VES award for painting out windmills, Chris. The one source of inspiration for Nolan that is as obvious as his love for Kubrick is James Bond. And that's what Tenet is. It's Nolan's Bond movie.
Tenet is a classic spy story. I grew up loving spy movies, particularly the Bond films.
A fun spy movie with a new take on gunfights, car chases and stunts. Being a Nolan movie, of course the first priority is how can we make the time manipulation seem real and not just like some CGI fest.
We used a lot of different techniques to achieve that, including a lot of in-camera photography, performers performing backwards or cars driving backwards, the camera running both forwards and backwards depending on the needs of it, and also CG.
So for instance, a tire pulling dirt backwards before it accelerates forwards was made with a car being towed backwards, then skidding just as it stops, painting out the tow cables and reversing the footage. The highway car chase was performed both forwards and backwards, with visual effects mostly needed to remove camera cars, add CGI cars, and most notably, the reversed half of this explosion is a CG explosion, not just the real explosion reversed, which would look pretty bad. The most famous stunt is undoubtedly the plane crash, which had very little visual effects.
Yeah, we got a 747, we're crashing it into a building. That's how we're achieving the 747 crashing into a building.
To clarify, they bought a defunct airplane with no engines, an empty fuselage, and towed it with a truck into a set wall built to collapse. And the only visual effects needed are to hide that this was just an empty fuselage being towed.
You know, there were visual effects involved in that we had to clean up the tow ropes and we added jet blasts to the engines and CG trees to be blown around.
Invisibly to everyone, the scene also features a CGI ambulance. The maneuvers performed in the sailing scene are pretty dangerous, so there were limits to what the actors could safely do.
We were able to remove the wing and tow the boat and get it up on the foils, which was very stable and very safe.
That was a scenario where it was safe to involve the actors. We knew we were going to have to do some of the sequence, on this other vehicle.
So there's face replacements, CG sails, and in this dangerous turn, the boat was really sailing straight ahead, so all the water is CGI. The bungee escape from Priya's apartment is real, but as they appear to snap the harnesses off, DNEG supervisor Andrew Lockley says to Esquire the actors are really still attached, and there's a handover to their digital doubles here. The inverted bullet hit in the opera house is CGI.
This is kind of how we make films. It's like if we can build it, we do. And if it's impossible, then we have to rely on our friends at VFX.
The final battle was also filmed as much as possible for real, but required extensive environment replacement on the mountains and the snow. Most helicopters were real, but there were also CGI helicopters. A CG dust explosion. When you have forward soldiers next to a huge reversed explosion, these people are really running backwards. And if you compare to how people actually run forwards, these guys really do look rather silly. So some of them are added in post. All the reversed soldiers have reversed CG gravel jumping towards their feet. This is a real forwards pass where every single little dust puff and explosion has been added in post.
The end scene in the film obviously contains a lot of big explosion events, and there's a combination of forwards and backwards explosions at the same time, and obviously you can't train an explosion to be backwards, so we had to add one half of that shot. So whenever there's a combination of two things, one of them has been added. We certainly did that a lot for the sequence where there's a minefield of people and trucks running up and down a hill with mines going off. And we used a combination of practical shot filmed elements, but also CG explosions, which had to incidentally match exactly the practical ones because they were right next to each other.
Tenet has 300 visual effects shots.
Our method of visual effects is try and do everything without them.
And the Oscar goes to Tenet.
And production VFX supervisor Andrew Jackson, DNEG visual effects supervisor Andrew Lockley, digital effects supervisor David Lee, and special effects supervisor Scott Fisher won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. And Tenet uses CGI. We already talked extensively about Oppenheimer in part 3 of No CGI, so I'll be quick. Oppenheimer has 200 visual effects shots under returning production VFX supervisor Andrew Jackson, of which 100 are entirely practical, achieved in camera and put in the final film with no post-production. Then it has another 100 visual effects shots that are processed by DNEG under their supervisor Giacomo Mineo using digital compositing, such as inserting the practical explosion in this shot and tracking in miniature rockets and smoke trails in this shot. Once again, the inspiration from Stanley Kubrick is evident, as they both create surreal visualizations of the wonders of the universe using liquids and other practical effects. So the last time I talked about Oppenheimer, I reached the conclusion that it used no CGI, and I stand by that, in that there are no 3D airplanes, 3D set extensions, or computer simulated explosions. But that requires splitting hairs about what's CGI and what is just visual effects, and I hate doing that, but here we are. In this shot, the spaceship is photographed, but the wave is CGI. That's a very clear distinction. These shots only have photographed elements, but they're still put together in the computer, so no real CGI. But how much can you manipulate and distort photographed elements with computer graphics before they stop being the photographed elements? Jackson describes shots like these to befores and afters as elements of fire and smoke going vertically that would then be unwrapped, turned inside out, and wrapped up the other way to produce a circular pattern. The bright star is another pass of liquid and particles behind it, and the background is a water tank with metal flakes. Nobody filmed these shots practically, or anything that even looks remotely like it. They were created in the computer by a visual effects artist using computer graphics, but all the little elements, the brushstrokes if you will, originate from photography. So, CGI schmegI. The truth is, no one in visual effects can tell you where the line goes between CGI and just visual effects, because it doesn't exist and we don't care. This hard separation between CGI and visual effects only matters to people who think CGI is cheating, but visual effects is not. What matters to us is, if a shot is not finished in camera, the photographed elements are sent to a visual effects company, and depending on what the shot requires, some departments will work on it and some departments will not. And we never stop to wonder, hey, was that really CGI or not? Because it doesn't matter. Oppenheimer has 200 visual effects shots, of which 100 used digital compositing, but they didn't use 3D animation, so they kinda did not use CGI. It's very clear now Nolan doesn't have one favorite genre. He loves all genres and wants to have a go at each. And now the turn has come to Sword and Sandals mythology films. So how much CGI is in the Odyssey?
And because Chris does everything in camera, if you see 1,000 people in a battle, there are 1,000 people there. There's no computer.
No CGI.
There's no CGI.
We could talk about the visual effects looking shots in the trailer and start speculating, but I'm gonna wait with that until we have more information. What I do know from the credits alone is there will be CGI. There will be digital matte paintings, CG environments, CG lighting, and there will be CGI creatures. Nolan is not afraid of CGI creatures. When he expressed his admiration of Gollum and the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park to Cinefex magazine, he added, "If I ever were to do a film that had a creature, I would do performance capture." I don't know if that's still how he feels, but headlines say he built a 60-foot practical rig for the giant in the Odyssey. I suspect this will be used like the full-size T-Rex in Jurassic Park, for close-ups like feet or a head, or in this case hands and arms reaching down, picking up people like the old King Kong hand. But it won't be able to walk full size, so like Jurassic Park, they will switch to another technique. Maybe CGI, maybe not. Game of Thrones just green screened a dude and that looked awesome. But the Odyssey doesn't have any green screen, so maybe not. The trailers have been getting critique for what people refer to as Batman armor, but as I said before, I couldn't care less about this stuff. The Odyssey could be Nolan's best film ever. But what I'm wondering is, which of the two Christopher Nolans made this movie? The movies that made Nolan the reinventor of blockbusters who we love today are movies like the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception and Interstellar, where he was not afraid to display his real lines on spectacular CGI, because that's just one of the many tools he needs to tell his stories. Who cares if this is not practical? It looks awesome! This is the guy who's clearly inspired by Star Wars, Blade Runner, Alien, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and in particular their use of visual effects to create fantastic worlds that cannot be achieved in camera. This is the guy who said to Cinefex, "Interstellar had things I wanted to do fully CGI, because that was the way of best getting to scientific reality." That is CGI Nolan. The other Nolan is the one who reduced 400,000 troops to 4,000 to make it look like he captured the entire movie in camera with no need for visual effects. and made the world's most dangerous explosion look like a barrel of gasoline because he was obsessed with the idea that CGI doesn't convey threat. That's no CGI Nolan. Sure, he always goes an extra mile for practical effects, and that's awesome. Marvel would never build a practical set and drench it in water, would they? Yes, Marvel does exactly the same. Check out VFX production manager Valentina Sklo's phenomenal videos about how where other movies use more CGI than people think, Marvel uses way more practical than people think.
This movie built the entire interior and part of the exterior so that the actors could interact with it for scenes in space. I am of course talking about the Marvels. I have never worked in one of those movies that didn't have a set built.
The main reason a Marvel movie has 2,000 visual effects shots and a Nolan movie has 500 is not that one prefers CGI and the other avoids CGI. It's just that a Marvel movie has more scenes that call for CGI and a Nolan story has more scenes that don't. If half the main cast of The Dark Knight needed some form of CGI augmentation like Two-Face, this film would also have 2,000 visual effects shots. I wish people would stop celebrating no CGI Nolan, because I think that's the bad Nolan. CGI Nolan is the good Nolan. And he recently said to Time, "I've developed a reputation for not liking visual effects, but my films have won 3 Oscars for visual effects. I know a lot about it and I'm really fascinated by it. But I like to make films with a grounded tone." And I think that somewhere in there, behind the pride, the Nolan that bent Paris for us and took us into a black hole, who thanked the Visual Effects Society for bringing his visions to life, is trying to come back out. You just have to let him. Whew, that was exhausting. Thumbs up if you watched the whole thing. If you want to fact check everything I said, you need to get a hold of these Cinefix issues. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you sticking around, so thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.